All right, and what's up? Welcome in. It is GC Live. Wes Mitchell here, Chris Clark. No intro today. We're working on getting that updated new season. Maybe even some new graphics on the way here soon. Chris, some pretty big news in the non-football world, but the GC Live world today. Our buddy Clint Hammond, he tells me he has entered the transfer portal. So,
Ooh, wow.
Still heavy supporter of GC Live. Actually, so we're going to have a new banner for Clint here shortly. But telling you guys about, there it is. Clint is now the branch manager with CMG Home Loans right here in Columbia. NMLS ID number 71597. Office is still 3300 Millwood Avenue, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. And you can still hit Clint up, 803-598-4810. And the story is the same, though. Clint is the same guy, same approach, same Gamecock fan, same personalized approach to everything, but different logo. He did have to enter the portal, but luckily he's still going to be talking to you about the Gamecocks if you call him, and he's still supporting us here on GC Live. So if you're in the market for a new home, of course, still give our guy Clint a shout. What do you say about that?
I am a big fan, always a fan of Clint Hammond. So, some people have pointed out, Wes, even though that guy's left a place, I'll always root for him. Like, there's some guys, they leave a place, you don't root for them because of the, maybe the parting of ways was not too great if you're a fan. But Clint Hammond's one of those guys. We follow him where he goes. He's awesome. And the good news is, no matter where Clint is, he's still going to do the same great job. And he's a Gamecock, right? He's not switching teams of the Gamecocks by any means. So that's just a little bonus for you. Does an outstanding job answering any mortgage questions, but he's also going to talk a little Gamecock recruiting with you. Or Gamecock football, because Wes, practice, last I checked, it starts later this week. So excited about that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the approach we're going to take today, Chris, is going to be, I would say 90%. Maybe we'll talk a little recruiting, but for the most part, I want to get into a preview of preseason practice starting. If you're looking at us on later on this week, we are live here on Wednesday, so one day away from what USC kind of calls their USC Media Day, which is also Report Day. That means if you like reading and viewing all the content, there will be plenty of it on Thursday. And so Shane Beamer will speak again. I don't know if there's a whole lot new for Coach to say because we heard from him, Preseason Beamer, heard from him at SEC Media Days, but he will be available to the media. More importantly, I would say in this context, because we have heard from Beamer, we've not heard as much this offseason from the assistant coaches. So we did hear from some of those guys at Preseason Beamer, but we'll hear from the assistant coaches again. And I believe, Chris, for the most part, pretty much every player will be available once again, as it was last year, to talk to the media and to update us on what's going on with everything there. So lots of content coming Thursday. And then, as you said, Friday, 9:23 a.m., first practice. Part of it will be open to the media. So we'll be able to provide some kind of those observations, those first looks. They aren't going to be out there running 11 on 11, unfortunately. But we will be able to get some eyeballs on some of these newcomers and get a look at maybe some guys that have dropped weight, added weight, reshaped, all those different things. So, dude, I mean, football is in the air. I know it's still warm today in Columbia, high of 93. There was even a twinge of chill in the air this morning. So we're almost there, man.
We are almost there. And I like what you said, the start of camp until the end, when it's August 31st and they're about to kick it off against Old Dominion, it's a progression for the players, of course. And it's going to be a progression of what we learn. Day one, all the folks here on YouTube, hopefully you're watching on YouTube or not, you're listening, you're on GamecockCentral.com, you're going to be wondering, hey guys, how does so-and-so look? How has the offense progressed? And remember, these guys are going to be out there getting acclimated. They're not going to be in full pads running 11 on 11 the first day. So there's going to be a progression to what we learn and what our takeaways are from preseason camp. Wes, I ran a piece, I think it's running today on GamecockCentral.com, 10 questions for the Gamecock offense. And honestly, it was pretty easy to come up with 10 questions. I'll have 10 questions about the defense. I'll have maybe not 10 questions about special teams, but I certainly have some questions, more so than in past years, about the special teams groups. And we're not going to get an answer probably to any of those things on day one. Even matters like depth chart. If we do get a glimpse of the depth chart drill through the first couple of days, that won't necessarily be indicative of what's going to happen with certainty when they kick off against Old Dominion. There's going to be a progression to these things and to what we learn. But it is, just like you said, an opportunity for us to eyeball some guys, which guys have reshaped their bodies, which guys have put on good weight, maybe which guys have dropped some weight in some instances. And are there some little crumbs of information for us? Do we get a glimpse, for instance, who are some guys that are rolling out returning kicks, returning punts? Do we get a look at that? Do we get a sense of, maybe who's second up at certain spots? Who's first up if they do line up in some type of depth chart drill at wide receiver? Tons of questions across this team. And, bit by bit, I think we'll pick some things up with what we get to see throughout our limited timeline and practice. But we'll also pick up some things, I think, behind the scenes and hopefully get some of these questions answered, or at least get closer as August goes on.
Yeah, and for those who haven't been on Gamecock Central lately, I've been kind of doing my annual let's project a depth chart and going through it, Chris. There were certain, I would say, on defense, not that everything is just set in stone. As we know, you got to go perform. And I think there's enough depth throughout this team. That's going to be like kind of, if you want to make a drinking game out of it, just count the times that depth is said in these upcoming press conferences. Like that will be, I believe, a trend, a talking point throughout preseason ball. They have depth. Now, who is going to emerge from that depth, I think is the question at a lot of spots. You look at the defense, for the most part, I feel like I could give you a decent idea of what that looks like. Now, there are some spots that you just might as well say, hey, those are co-starters. Like one of them might, or two of them, if you're talking about like defensive line and you're in a four-man front, two of your interior defensive linemen are going to get to start that day. But it may be a lot like last year where you're talking about 3 or 4 guys just splitting the reps pretty much down the middle throughout the course of a game, and that's fine. I think the interesting conversations, though, are going to be more at your positions where, offensive line. You have 5 guys out there. You have 5 spots. There's a lot of cross-training. A guy can play left or right guard. Some of them can play guard or tackle. And, yeah, you may rotate a guy in here or there, or maybe somebody gets dinged up. Maybe a helmet falls off. But for the most part, we always talk about continuity on the O-line. So I think for South Carolina, that's where it gets interesting in the depth at those positions. We'll get to wide receiver in a second because, it's a mouthful there. I think we have a starting point on the O-line. Now, if you told me it looked even completely different in 30 days, I would buy that. I really would. Like, I think there is going to be heavy jockeying for position on this offensive line. Now, I think if nobody sort of steps up and takes a spot from the guy in front of them, then you can have a pretty solid O-line out of this bunch. I think best case scenario, though, is we do see some guys that maybe you would list as a backup, and by the end of camp, we say they've just pushed so hard that they've found a spot in that starting lineup.
Aren't there a couple guys that it seems like are going to be pretty hard to unseat on the O-line? It would be very surprising to me, and I fully agree with your point that this thing could change a lot. It could change a lot at offensive line, could change a lot at receiver. There are a few spots where the competition is really, really fierce, and there's more competitive depth than in the past. Linebacker on defense may be one, right? Where, you couldn't say, I'm completely shocked by this particular thing, this particular guy, stepping up and becoming a starter. Wouldn't be a shock given who they have brought into this roster as transfers. So I think, Vershawn Lee at center is going to be hard to unseat. You look at what we've heard behind the scenes. Even Shane Beamer has kind of gone the farthest with Vershawn Lee when talking about the offensive line is, hey, it's really great to have a guy like Vershawn Lee at center. It's just going to be tough, I think, for anybody to beat him out. And that's even recognizing that they have some other potentially good options at center. Torricelli Simpkins III could play center, could play guard. Kamar Bell, same thing. Ryan Brubaker is going to be in the mix coming off that injury. But Vershawn Lee seems to be pretty locked in, one of the more locked in guys on the entire team with his spot. And I think Kason Henry at right tackle is probably going to be pretty tough to beat. Maybe not unbeatable, right? But maybe not to the level of Lee, but pretty tough to beat. But you got several spots on that offensive line that are kind of up for grabs. West receiver is a great one. I know I'm not going to give it away. Subscribers at GamecockCentral.com can check it out. Your depth chart projections. I mean, your opening line in that I will give away. This is where it gets interesting, because there is no doubt more competitive depth. There's more bodies, but there's more important than that. There's more guys where you could say, okay, I could see that guy over the course of the preseason making a run at getting into that top 6, getting into a starting role. And it's just more of a question this season than it was really throughout the entirety of the 2023 season.
Yeah, and man, I almost I was this close to just saying, here are the 9 guys in the running. I'm just not even gonna do a depth chart. But I was like, you know what? If the name of the article is depth chart and we're trying to project it, because I do try to source those things to an extent. Like obviously there's some opinion in there. Like I'm not reporting this is the depth chart. It's a fun exercise. It's more of like, hey, this is an opinion on based on the information, here is an educated opinion on which way it could go. And, there's some spots where throughout the names I put out, there were some spots where I was able to get it on pretty good authority, like, hey, this is a good place to start. Wide receiver, I've asked around. I have gotten so many different answers on. And again, it may even, I feel like I maybe have a better idea of how it might play out than I even have on who's going to line up first on Friday. Because that was the whole point of the exercise, not to project ahead a month. Who's lining up with the ones as South Carolina runs out there Friday morning for practice number 1? And then, do you give the edge to some older guys? Do you give the edge to guys who maybe, do you make a transfer who didn't, there's multiple transfers, but some of them didn't even get here until the summer. So do you make those guys kind of work their way up behind some of the other guys? I felt like we didn't hear as much about Jared Brown in the spring, but now I feel like I've actually started to hear quite a bit of buzz about Jared Brown. How far along has Nick Harbor come? I think Harbor, Chris, is the guy that you're going, okay, if he can develop, and you're not talking about physical development, you're talking about skill. You're talking about all the little nuances that go into playing wide receiver. If he develops as a wide receiver, he's too big and fast not to be on the field, right? But we can't predict. We don't know if that's going to happen. I tend to think if I'm trying to create a depth chart, if I'm spot on Jared Brown, I think Jared Brown, and I'll say if, I'm not reporting it as a fact. There's a lot of positioning to be had here. I think Jared Brown's in the starting lineup. I think where he plays is going to be dependent on the other guys, kind of what I would say is that X position. Does a Nick Harbor come along the way every Gamecock fan hopes? Does Delvon Campbell come in and sort of say, I'm a veteran. I'm big, I'm fast, I'm grabbing a spot. We know Dow Loggins wants to add some additional size to the field among this group. So I kind of look at it, man, like that X spot, Nick or Delvon, potentially, whoever steps up there starts at X. If so, if nobody steps up, I think that's where Jared Brown maybe has to play that spot. But one of those stepping up, then I slide Jared Brown into the other starting spot. Then, depending on everybody else, we've got an all-out battle. Gage Larvidan, great spring. That means something. Mazio Bennett, he's someone we've heard about since the moment he arrived. Luke Doty is going to be a solid contributor in this bunch. I'll get to my X factors here in a second, my wild cards, but I mean, I haven't even named everybody yet, and we're already getting like into 4, 5, 6 guys that have a shot to be starting.
Yeah, and that speaks to, exactly what we were just talking about, and that is, one of the goals this offseason, get more competitive depth at certain positions. And offensively, again, when Xavier Luedecke was not on the field last season, South Carolina did not have enough competitive depth. Some of that was numbers. Some of it was inexperience. Like, you think back to the Clemson game last year. You had a guy in Luke Doty who's been back and forth. This will be really, Wes, one of the first times where has a prolonged, I'm a wide receiver for several months in a row, where I can go through spring, even though he did some quarterback stuff, summer, preseason, and like the plan is more, you're a receiver, I'm a receiver. You had Peyton Mangrum, who's played a good bit of ball, former walk-on. You had Nick Carber as a true freshman. Tyshawn Russell, true freshman, right? So it's not like you had 5, 6 guys who were juniors and seniors and have played a lot of college football at some level. Forget even just South Carolina and the SEC, at some level. Well, now you plug in what I just mentioned with Doty, having more experience, more focus at receiver. You do have Mangrum still, but you've got some young guys that are now, they got their feet wet last year, a Harbor, a Russell. But now you've plugged in 5 transfers. 4 of them have played a lot of college football. Vandrevius Jacobs is the only one that hadn't played a lot of ball. Not former 4-star, talented guy. We'll see where he factors in. But you were adding a lot more, some different skill sets, some proven production, even if it's not in the SEC at South Carolina, some guys with translatable traits that have produced at the college level. And that's more than you had last season. So ultimately, the question is going to be, whoever is out there on August 31st and beyond, can they produce, right? That is the key question. But for now, it is who's going to lock down those starting jobs, who's going to be out there first in preseason, who's kind of in that top 6. And because of that added depth, it's really up in the air, I think.
Yeah, and I think, and I haven't mentioned yet Amari Huggins-Bruce. That's someone that, we think is going to be able to help this team in some way. Something about him I've been told is there's definitely some versatility here in that he could help at any number of those wide receiver spots, which helps you get on the field, frankly. And so then I think the question there is, like, the word depth gets thrown around a lot. It can mean different things. I feel like, let's talk about the D-line for just as an example in comparison. You have some proven guys. Like, you have some guys that have gone out and done it at the SEC level that have been starters, and they've done it in the Garnet and Black. So you look at it, you say you have depth, but it's truly proven depth. I think you look at that receiver room, and it's depth in that you do have a number of guys you can list out and say, this guy has a chance. Now, do you sit there and say you're convinced 100% that this group is going to be ready to go be what they need to be? I think if you're being fair and you're being honest with yourself, you can't quite say that yet. Like, I think if you're a Gamecock fan, you're probably hopeful. You probably have a reason to be hopeful. that the cream will rise to the top, so to speak, that depth will – you hope that depth will create 3 true starters, frankly, and then that the next 3 will kind of fall in line behind them. I think there are a couple of wild cards, I would call it, or X factors that maybe aren't the first names you mentioned, but if they can get consistent, if they can increase their consistency, maybe they come out of nowhere and push into the starting lineup. I think Tyshawn Russell has flashed. We saw that last year. We saw that in the spring game. He flashed a couple of times there. I thought coming in, Vandrevius Jacobs, when you look at you just mentioned it, the experience ahead of him, I thought, maybe next year is more realistic for him. I've heard enough buzz at this point, Chris, that he's flashed during the summer from what I've heard. So is there a case to be made, or really it's not even a case, is there a path? Is there a path where Jacobs just is like, guys, I'm really good. Like, I'm going to play. Like, his practice play necessitates him to get on the field. Like, I think if you're him, if you're one of the more inexperienced guys, you're not looking at this like there's a lot of guys in this room and there's 3 returning starters. You're looking at this like there's a lot of guys in this room. They're all talented, but those starting roles completely up for grabs.
Yeah, and most of the time, the answer to the question is, the players are going to determine what this is. It's a very important year. I don't think are there instances in the past that have happened, not just at South Carolina, at other places where you go, well, why hadn't that guy been playing? And he gets in the game and you're like, yeah, really, why had he not been playing? Some people said that about Ben Martin Scott last year, fair, probably in that instance on defense. But most of the time, the guys that are practicing the best, that are most consistent, are going to be on the field. And it's not going to be a deal this year where it's like, well, we don't really know who it is because we just don't have enough depth to figure that out. Or, yeah, we're not getting good enough performance, but we don't have many options. This time they have more options. And, I think rising tide lifts all boats type of thing, right? You're ultimately, you've got more guys out there. You're going to have more competition, and that's healthy. And that's exactly what this team needed at multiple spots. And obviously receiver is one of those.
Yeah, for sure. Clint asked a great question. How can a player flash during the summer? So I guess if you want to argue semantics, maybe they can't. I don't know. What I mean by that is they flashed in that the people we talk to and are around and speak to about the program, which names do we hear? Which names do we hear in terms of guys that a lot of times you're talking about the player run practices, which is them out there sometimes against air, other times just in one-on-one, sometimes 7-on-7 settings where, the quarterbacks sort of put together a plan and they go execute it, but the coaches aren't really allowed to be out there. There is a little bit more that the coaches are able to do with the players during the summer than they used to be able to do. So essentially that just means, hey, we've heard some buzz. That's the word I go back to a lot of times, Chris. We've heard some buzz about this guy. Frankly, now we would never report this because it's just negativity for no reason, and it's not really fair to the kids. Like, there's been times we'll be like, hey, what do you think about this guy this year? And we'll be told, not this year. Like, not happening, And there have actually been cases, Chris, where I've heard a guy probably won't make an impact this year, and it's from the best source you could possibly imagine. But the player didn't think that way, and they just work and push their way into there and take advantage of their opportunities. So I think, and Clint says, thanks, I try to keep my expectations at a wait-and-see level. I think that's 100% fair. I really do. we've seen guys create buzz in the summer, and it does not always translate to the game field in the fall. Like, that is fair. I would like to think it's a good guide to sort of know what to expect. I mean, the guy who created the most buzz 2 years ago was Nicky Mawari. And, he steps right in, before his freshman year. And, it's starting right off the bat after, what was that, like I can't even remember, the seventh play of the season. He was basically a starter from that point forward. So that stuff matters, but I agree. If you want to take a wait and see approach, that is certainly fair, and you're right, because it does not always translate. But I use it in our writing as a guide. Who do I need to be looking for? Who do I need to be paying attention to? Who do I need to be asking about this preseason, and of course in the lead into games during the season?
Yeah, more often than not, guys that you're hearing buzz about are the guys to pay attention to, that as a percentage, as a ratio, those guys end up being the ones that do factor into these position battles. How much of an impact will a certain guy or a position group make? Those are the guys that factor in more so than guys we've just literally heard nothing about. Like you said, guys can kind of come out of nowhere or outperform their expectations from earlier in the season or over the summer. There can be guys that flashed, and we heard a lot of good things about during the summer, that don't ultimately do it. But the point is, if you're looking at the buckets of, all right, who are the guys to really look out for? Generally, it is the ones that you've heard the most about, right? I mean, Dylan Stewart's a great example of that. They're probably, Lenora Sellers might be the other one, but on this entire team, has anybody drawn more buzz from January on than Dylan Stewart? I don't think so. And that's been workouts. We've actually had some tangible, like, he did go through spring practice, and we heard plenty of buzz about how well he played in the scrimmages. We saw it during the spring game. We saw the Twitter pictures of his transformation physically, right? Like, there's plenty of evidence of it. Now, does he still have to go translate that into getting some sacks this year? Sure, absolutely, and performing well in year one. But if we're picking, hey, who's the guy that's going to step up at edge, you're probably starting with Dylan Stewart as opposed to somebody that maybe you haven't heard anything about the entire year.
Yeah, for sure. I want to get a little bit more into Dylan, actually, and kind of talk about realistic expectations there. But first, let me tell you about our friend Andy Luedecke over at My Perfect Franchise. Check out myperfectfranchise.net. Phone number 404-973-9901. Maybe asking yourself, hopefully you're not asking yourself because you've already heard us talk about Andy. But Andy is a franchise consultant, also a franchise owner, so he's right there in it himself. He knows all about the day-to-day of franchise ownership. But what he does is helps people find franchises that will fit their skill sets, financial requirements, time to commit, and more. So if you're looking for maybe a side job or to even leave your current job and experience business ownership, Andy's here to help. And best of all, services are 100% free because he's going to help you match up with a franchise that is looking for someone with your skill set. So that is very valuable to those franchises. So no fee on your end. Again, that phone number, 404-973-9901. Or you can just shoot Andy an email, andy@myperfectfranchise.net. As always, shout out to Andy for being a supporter, not just of GC Live, but of several of the different podcasts around the On3 network. Chris, Dylan Stewart, I believe, is the case of the preseason sort of fan base hype kind of matching what my expectations are for him on the field as a true freshman. Just based on, I guess, my judgment of what I think the expectations are from the fan base. Like, if you're expecting him to be clowny or something, like, that's a you problem. But the people that are saying, this kid is going to make a big impact as a true freshman, this kid has as much, if not more, natural just pass rush ability than most guys that have shown up at South Carolina in a long time, I would say, based on everything we've been told to this point, like I'm kind of beyond the wait and see with Dylan Stewart. Like, am I interested to wait and see just how high this thing can go as a true freshman? Of course. Am I interested to see, can he be? I mean, what even is the upside here, man? Like, I don't think there's much of a cap on what the upside could be. Can he be what James Pierce is for Tennessee? Like, I think that's realistic. Like, that's a high bar. I'm not saying he will be that, but there's not many guys that you can just look at and even have the conversation about when they're just a true freshman and not feel like you're just kind of blowing smoke and being a little bit, dramatic with some hyperbole involved and all those things. I think that's a realistic conversation for what he could ultimately be at South Carolina, just based on what we knew about him as a recruit and what we've learned about his work ethic and his development so far at South Carolina.
Yeah, and it's fair to say, hey, he's not going to be this year what he's going to be as a junior. And yes, there will still be some growing pains. And generally here for a guy that's a freshman, playing the run is going to be more of an adjustment as opposed to get out there and go get the quarterback. Which is going to be, I think, his bread and butter year one, and really his bread and butter as a player generally. But Wes, he's so talented and has shown enough to where I think it's fair to turn it from I'm just going to completely wait and see to it. You can put some expectations on Dylan Stewart. Now don't blow it out of proportion. Don't say if he doesn't look like one of the top 10 pass rushers in the country, I'm going to be convinced he's a bust. Don't go overboard on it. But yeah, I mean, James Pierce, sure, he could certainly be that. I mean, he was a similar ranking, right, out of high school. He's got all the tools. You don't look at him and go, not sure about the size, not sure about the athleticism. He checks all those boxes. And point you bring up often, Wes, is he has really worked hard since he's gotten here, answered any question that may have been out there about that from everything we've heard, everything we've seen. You see it in his transformation photo that's got Gamecock Nation buzzing. He's just got a chance to be a really, really good one. And I think it's okay on third down when he's out there this year to feel like if you say Dylan Stewart needs to make something happen here, you can actually have, I think, that expectation. I think that's fair.
Yeah, man. And I, not to belabor this point, but I do think the recruiting industry has gotten pretty good about saying, hey, this dude's a 5-star ability, right? Now, does that mean he's definitely going to perform like a 5-star? Of course not. But then usually with the 5-star guys, especially if we're not talking about a quarterback, I think a quarterback, maybe O-line to an extent, but definitely I put quarterback just away from everybody else from a prospect standpoint. That's a completely different process of evaluating and completely different percentages on, if you hit on 50% of them, do you feel good? If you hit on 33% of your quarterbacks, do you feel good? You know what I'm saying? Like, I judge it completely differently. But among any other position on the field, if you're a 5-star, you have all the tools. It's just a matter, can you avoid the bad luck, the injury luck? That's something none of us can predict. But for the most part, do you have some football IQ about you? Are you willing to work? Are you willing to do all the things mentally, physically, nutritionally to get yourself where you need to be? And, good thing for Gamecock fans is that I think Dylan has exceeded all those things that maybe you would expect out of a true freshman. I think he's kind of risen to the challenge. This is a guy who really physically was just not challenged very much in high school, if you watch the film. And some guys, when they get kind of punched a little bit, when they get to college, it takes a second for them to, like, okay, wow, these guys are bigger than in high school. I don't think there's been any hesitation from Dylan to kind of punch back. And I do think, Chris, there's a world where Dylan Stewart is just too good to be a reserve. Like, I think there's a world where you watch the lineups hit the Jumbotron over there against Old Dominion, and it's, hey, starting at edge, true freshman, Dylan Stewart. But I also think the additions of Kyle Kennard and bringing back Gilbert Edmond puts them in a position where Dylan does not have to go start. Like, if he's just too good not to start, then so be it. But it will be for that reason, as opposed to you saying he's good, but we have to throw him out there, which might, if Dylan was on last year's team, he would have surefire 100%, no question, have been a day one starter.
Yeah, I mean, remember against this is during the Muschamp era, and they've got as a true freshman, they've got Sandage playing against Georgia, who was a highly ranked guy, but he's a true freshman playing a lot. Or I mean, we've all seen this in the past where you go, last year the offensive line, Trey Balltree, Babalade, very talented recruits. They're going to be really good players, I think, but do they need to be out there as true freshmen in that circumstance? No, and they weren't going to be until the injuries. So kind of relates back to receiver and linebacker and offensive line and all these situations we're talking about. You want to build up enough depth to where you can just say, we're playing this guy because he's the best. But Dylan Stewart has, I think, the talent level to do that. And I think, when you mentioned James Pierce, and it kind of loops into this conversation, I believe it was Clayton White say something at Birdies for Beamer the other day on the record to somebody, and that was that they were kind of studying the offseason about play up front. And the top defensive lineman in the country, who he said from Tennessee, so I imagine he was talking about James Pierce, plays 35 snaps a game. What have we seen in the past at South Carolina? You look back and go, that edge, that defensive tackle, that linebacker played 70 snaps in the game. And then we're writing our wrap-ups on Monday or Sunday after the game. South Carolina's defense got gassed at the end. Good effort, they got gassed. You don't want to hear that anymore, right? So they're now in a position on paper, yes, in the front six, in the front seven, to where you can play guys less to be more effective. Debo Williams has talked about it. Demetrius Knight's talked about it. The staff's talked about it. Can you rotate guys in more to where, yeah, we're sitting here talking about, well, who's going to start out of these top 4 defensive tackles who are all upperclassmen? Does it really matter? The best guys are going to start. Maybe you start a guy in a matchup situation. But really, can you just split up their reps more effectively to where you're not losing as much from first group to second group and keep those guys fresher? So, whether or not Stewart starts or Boogie Huntley at defensive tackle or Demetrius Knight at linebacker, do you have more depth? Yes. And can you rotate those guys more in and out while keeping your same effectiveness or close to it?
Yeah, then that's not even to mention the whole 4-2-5, 3-3-5. What does that look like? What guys does that put on the field versus this package putting other guys on the field? And there's really, Clayton White's got to feel like he's got options this year. And there's been times when he's been here that he's not had a lot of options, and he's got to feel that way. And Chris, what are you reading, man? You have this look on your face like you just read something bad.
It was it was confusing. It was confusing. Okay. I'm good. Right. We're good. Sorry.
That was what you were reading, or what I was saying?
No. It was that. Yeah, that just dawned on me. I was not even reacting to what you were saying. I was definitely reading something.
I was like, Chris is not in agreement with
we multitask. Something. Yes.
Yeah, you just had this look, but yeah. So I think he's got to feel pretty good about his options. You always want more depth, right? But I think my question for maybe this entire team, man, I think they have more depth across the board. Like I think we can actually say that almost definitively. I don't like to say things definitively until we get into preseason ball and frankly, until we play some games. But I think we can say that. Here's the question, though. Like last year, with what we saw on the field, maybe we weren't saying this about these guys going into the season, but you knew in, like, let's say a Spencer Rattler, let's say very early in the season, after a couple of games, you're like, all right, Luedecke is he's like reached his college potential. Like he's a man among boys. Yeah. Yeah. Um not that this is the metric anyone should be looking at, but remember when EA came out with the top 100 players for the game, and basically that was like, these are the 100 players that people who follow college football sort of know because they're impact guys and they've proven it at this level. South Carolina didn't have anybody on there. So I think it's a little bit reverse of what we've seen from a lot of South Carolina teams. Almost every South Carolina team you've ever watched run out there has had a couple of stars. Like, it has had some guys that the opponents had to game plan for. Go back, even some of those Spurrier teams that were really good, there were positions, Chris, where you were going, they cannot afford injuries at that particular spot. Yeah. This group, I think they've used the portal well to build some depth. But the question is, you're playing, Alabama. You're playing LSU. You're playing Ole Miss. You're playing at Oklahoma. What do your starters do? You know what I'm saying? Like, are they able to be difference makers? You're breaking in a new quarterback. Can Lenoris be a difference maker for you? Can those 9 wide receivers we talked about, can 3 of them be really good and maybe one of them rise a little bit to the occasion of, if it's third down in a game-winning drive situation, who am I drawing something up for to get the ball to? Does that make sense? Like, I'm wondering, I think the question is just a little bit different for this team than most of the ones we've seen at South Carolina. The depth is there, but are my difference makers going to be there?
Yeah, and the other problem that we have in assessing this team is you can look at South Carolina and say, if you're a person that says, yes, I think they are without a doubt a better team, which I actually subscribe to that because of the depth, right? I recognize you lose your 2 best players on offense. You go, well, how are they going to be better? They weren't very good, and they lost their 2 best players. But it's because of the other gaps that you filled in, more depth, a former 1,400-yard rusher at what was your biggest problem position aside from offensive line, healthier on the O-line, so as a baseline you should be better, et cetera, et cetera. We can do a whole show on that. The problem is, though, look, some other teams on South Carolina's schedule this year have also gotten better. Could Kentucky be better than they were last year? Very possible, right? Very possible. That they seem to think so in Lexington. They have some questions and issues too, but talking with those guys over there and reading their material, they feel like, yeah, this particular aspect of the team will be better than last year. Missouri doesn't look like they're taking a step back. A&M will probably be better than they were last year, et cetera, et cetera. Then you've got some teams we know are elite. Bama on the road. Nick Saban left. Okay, here comes Kalen DeBoer, who's lost 12 games in his entire college career, coaching at Bama, who's still loaded with talent, right? So it doesn't get any easier. And the problem is, yeah, we know we think very strongly that South Carolina will be a better team, but does that equate to more wins? We don't know because we don't have a measuring stick yet. Old Dominion, despite all the jokes that I've enjoyed about, getting into an overtime battle with Old Dominion, you hope that doesn't happen. That's not probably going to be measuring stick game. Kentucky is, though, and it's early, right? So that first quarter of the season, I think we will learn a lot about this team and where they are. And so that's why right now we're left to talk about position battles and things like that. The question of whether or not the first line, the starters that you mentioned, are going to be good enough to be difference makers, man, I don't think we know that yet because there are legitimate questions there.
Yeah, and I think like anything, there are levels to it. And do you ever really know how anybody's going to perform? Of course not. Like, there can be a guy who, now we don't see this very often, but there can be a guy who is an experienced veteran quarterback and they just have a down year and nobody ever predicts it or projects it because you've seen them go play well. Still humans, still 18 to 23 years old, still have girlfriends who could break up with them and ruin their week on the biggest game of the year. You know what I'm saying? Things happen. But for the most part, I think you look at it like a lot of things in life. I look at it as percentages. Like, what are the chances that you're going to get what you need from that guy? And when you're talking about players that have not been out there, or at least have not been out there at the SEC level, there's still going to be some level of unknown. And, I don't know which guys you want to completely like put the onus on. Football is a beautiful game, man, and that it is you can win so many different ways. And you may not have it in one area one year, and there may be some teams that can expose that, but there may be other teams that can't. And you can go win by running the football. You can go win by throwing the football. You can go win with the defensive battle. And I think ultimately, though, a lot of this, I mean, how much of it comes down to 16, to Lenoris, to how ready is he? I think nobody that's watched the kid play is doubting his ability. Nobody is doubting the fact that he has tremendous amount of upside. Nobody's doubting his character or his work ethic. He's a great kid, great family, checks all those boxes on the paper. But does he have to go do it? Of course. To your point, Chris, is this entire league better now? Like, are you just playing against not just individually some teams that have gotten better? Is the standard to be a successful team within this conference, if it was here before, has it bumped up a couple of levels?
Yeah.
I mean, Oklahoma and Texas didn't come in here to go 500. I promise you.
Even the bad teams are good, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, really, there might be a couple this year in the league that you look at and go, that's a bad football team.
Shout out, Vandy.
Shout out Vandy, maybe Mississippi State. Even then, Wes, they're still capable of being competitive on a given Saturday. And so, look, that's not an excuse. Ultimately, you're judged on wins and losses, and that's where you want to be. Nobody's sitting around going, if you're sitting around going, well, South Carolina's always been this way, now it's even harder, whatever. That's not a good attitude to have. But there does have to be on the climb, this recognition that it is hard. And it's, Missouri not too long ago was back-to-back 6-win seasons. Now they're being put in the college football playoff projections, and they're doing really, really well. Ole Miss, way better than they were a few years ago. You bring Texas and Oklahoma in. So it is harder and harder. And so that's why, again, to properly assess this team, we need that measuring stick that we don't quite have. And they're typically in a South Carolina football season, there are ups and downs, even in the elite teams. We were just talking about this morning, Wes. South Carolina beats number one Bama in 2010. Next week, they go lose to Kentucky. There are ups and downs. Even for teams that have won national titles at other schools, sometimes they go undefeated, but sometimes they go, how'd they lose to that team in the regular season? There might be ups. Carolina may lose to Kentucky early in the season. Does that mean the season's over? Well, it's not a great sign, but it could just be an aberration. So it's going to be a fun ride week to week. There'll be frustrations. There will be high points probably. I agree with you on Sellers, by the way, real quick. We've said often, you got to temper expectations. He's a redshirt freshman starting for the first time. As talented as he is, as good as I think he could be and will be, actually. Got to recognize that there'll be a progression there. There will be bumps in the road. At the same time, even he plays the most important position on the field, and his performance is going to go a long way toward determining how good this offense and ultimately this team can be.
And at the same time, are you going to be shocked if that kid just goes out there and it just looks easy to him?
No, because I mean it did in high school. It has, in the limited glimpses that we've had in practice. Does that mean it will against, Bama and Tuscaloosa? Probably not. Maybe not. But there are some guys that are special. And Wes, if you talk to some guys that have been around college football a long time, even guys that are a little bit more like pessimistic, realist, they put his talent level and his tool set up against some guys who, I'm just saying, are really, really good. So that kind of makes your ears perk up a little bit and say, okay, yeah. So no, I would not be surprised at all, but still need to see it, which is fair.
Yeah, still got to go see it. I mean, I always think it's fascinating when a guy goes from just someone we talk about on a show like this, or fans talk about the potential and what they could be, and they just make that jump where you just look around and you're like, oh, they're a household name now. Like, they're a superstar. I tell you what, the most recent example for me, different sport, you remember just looking around, I can't even tell you what game, but all of a sudden you were like, wait a second, Colin Murray Boyles is a superstar now. Like,
Yeah.
he is. Like, he's gone from being a guy South Carolina fans may talk about to, if you're an SEC basketball fan and you really care and you're watching your team play the Gamecocks, you're like, I know who CMB is. And so, there are levels to that as well. Are you a national superstar? Are you a guy in your conference that is a superstar? Is it more just like you go from maybe the hardcore fans know who you are to like the casual? If a casual Gamecock fan saw you in a restaurant, would they not look twice at you, or would they be like, "Oh my God, that's Lenora Seller"? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
there are levels to everything. But I think the schedule actually sets up fairly well for Sellers to. You start against Old Dominion, which, again, no disrespect to Old Dominion, but if there's countless other teams there, what?
I just love how we have to constantly be like, no disrespect to this
Okay,
team.
all disrespect to Old Dominion compared to everybody else on the schedule, except for like Akron. That's a game where would you rather start with Old Dominion or Oklahoma? Of course you'd love to let him settle in. I mean, I'd love for the guy to go out there and just have an efficient, solid game. Then you build up, right? Kentucky is the biggest swing game, maybe the entire season, certainly of the first half of the season, and it's on the road, but still, not that you can look past Kentucky. This is going to be a battle. But again, compared to going to Alabama, or even, dude, I put Ole Miss up there this year. That's a loaded football team. Compared to some of these other teams, that's not a bad first road test to send your redshirt freshman quarterback. So he passes that test or those tests, then you have LSU coming to town. So it does sort of step up nicely, I think, for a young quarterback.
Yeah, potentially so. And, I'm sure I'll repeat this 100 times in the next 30 days, in the next month. But, man, how nice would it be for South Carolina fans and for this team's confidence and to give us some answers, to be able to come out and just like beat Old Dominion. And by that, I don't mean win the scoreboard by a couple touchdowns, like just win convincingly. Think about Shane Beamer's first 3 openers at South Carolina. Last year they lost, of course, and that was a huge buzzkill with the fashion that it happened in. But even the past 2 years, 2021, they played no disrespect to Eastern Illinois, but that was the second worst team I've ever seen play college football. It was 46-0, but you still walked away going, Georgia State, Carolina won comfortably at the end of the day. Well, they won by 3 touchdowns, I think. But that was mainly because of the defense and a bunch of blocked kicks. You walked away from that one going, that was ugly on the part. And I remember Spencer Rattler after the game being like, that was ugly, you know? And then they lost last year. Can you come out and just look like you got it together in game one? I think that would be huge. And I'll repeat that again, probably next week. But just something that was on my mind. Can you come out and it was to your point specifically about Sellers, go out, get him a win, build his confidence up, and get this thing going in the right direction.
And, you know, frankly, dude, a lot of the fan base, they're in show me mode right now. So I think it would go a long way. We're about out of time here. It would go a long, long, long way to just ease the fan base down a couple of notches if you could just go, let them watch you beat Old Dominion in a little bit more of a, I don't think methodical is the word, more like just a controlling way, you know, where at halftime you're like, South Carolina's controlling this game. You're not sitting there going, we're in trouble if we don't play well in the second half. And, you know, I think you look at those first 2 games kind of together, and essentially you're going to say, you could feel if you're a Gamecock fan, you could feel really good. Travis Ford says beating ODE by 5 or 50 changes nothing. I disagree as much as someone could possibly disagree with anything. The entire vibe going into the next week would be completely, entirely different with those 2 outcomes. And your ability to get some of your young players on the field in the second half and get them acclimated to a new season is completely different if it's a blowout versus a close game. So I think for South Carolina, and we're getting ahead of ourselves, we got an entire month to talk about that game, but if we're getting ahead of ourselves there, I think that is a opportunity to sort of build up your fan base a little bit more going into what is already going to be a very key stretch of your season. But, all right, we're out of time for today. Try to do this Friday, Chris. You think that's possible?
Possible.
We're going to get to see some practice. So, hopefully there'll be plenty to talk about. Thursday, you will hear from, I think somebody asked earlier when we hear from Beamer. You will hear from Beamer on Thursday, hear from assistants on Thursday, hear from players on Thursday, and then a little bit of practice will be open on Friday and Saturday. So plenty of content coming up on Gamecock Central. We want to see you over there on GamecockCentral.com, but of course, want to see you here on the podcast and on the YouTube as well. Hit subscribe on the Gamecock Central YouTube. We're out of here. We'll be back soon. For Chris, I'm Wes. Appreciate y'all, and we'll see you soon.